Just a bit over a month after release, Wildlight Entertainment has announced that they are closing Highguard, with the servers being scheduled to close on the 12th of March. The announcement was made on Twitter in an article by the studio themselves, marking the end of their journey just 45 days after its release. This is the post in question, and it basically just goes over the announcement, saying that they are happy about the 2 million players that has stepped into Highguard since launch, and they are hoping to release one final update, a new warden, a new weapon, and account level progression, and skill trees as well. Now, why these things weren't in the game to begin with is beyond me, but it's a nice addition to the game as it's currently closing. And this post was made on March 3rd, so they have since released these new things, and people have been playing with it since the update was released. And yeah, just a nice little retouch of the game, if you will, or it eventually closes. Now, for a live service game, shutting down a bit over a month after release is not exactly uncommon lately, but with every live service game and the closure thereof, it still represents countless hours of work and unrealized possibilities, as well as just the jobs being lost. This is especially striking given how these games are meant to function and the way that they are meant to evolve over time, over their life cycle, and often relying on updates and community feedback as well to stabilize their player base. I wanted to take this moment to fully understand how things reached this point. I think it's worth looking into how the recent investigation by Bloomberg journalist Jason Schreier, who dug into the story behind Highguard and the studio behind it as well. Now, according to Jason Schreier, a very notable and trustworthy journalist in the industry, the story begins all the way back in 2021, where a group of developers from Respawn, the studio behind Apex Legends, decided to leave and form a new independent company called Wildlight Entertainment. The goal was to regain some of the creative freedom they felt they have lost since working on the Respawn, which later on became part of Electronic Arts, or EA for short. And one of their key ideas was to structure the company in a very different way than we usually see in the industry. Particularly, I want to cover this from the point of view of this article in question, and this is the article from Jason Schreier, and it reads the story behind the failure of Highguard. So I want to go through this article, and if you want to read it yourself, you can, of course. But yeah, I'm gonna go through it and offer my thoughts as we go along with it. As mentioned before, some of the quotes that I wanted to go through is in particular this very quote. The Wildlight founders decided to do things differently. One of their plans was to set up a profit sharing program so that if the studio did deliver another big success, everyone would benefit. An enticing setup that ultimately helped Welch and his co-founders attract many of their former Respawn colleagues to the new company. And what's particularly striking with this is the fact that if the studio succeeded with any kind of endeavor they decided to take on, everyone would share in that success. As is obvious, the normal way of dividing profits is for the studio to receive the biggest cut and not their employees necessarily. And this new way of dividing profits definitely helped morale and to foster a positive workplace. And so combined with their experience working on Apex Legends, this helped the founders recruit several former Respawn colleagues to the newly founded studio. And with that recruitment, the team also required a significant funding to follow along. And as stated in the article, they were armed with a significant amount of funding from Tencent, and Wildlight began hiring employees and making plans for their first new game. Interestingly enough, the project was wildly perceived as an indie-style effort, a small studio founded by developers who had worked on Apex Legends as well as Titanfall 2, but in reality, the studio had substantial financial backing behind it, making people question whether they truly could be considered an indie studio at this point. However, development did not go as smoothly as they would have hoped it would. In the article, he reports that roughly 2 years into development of the game that they eventually would come to be Highguard as we know it, the team realized the original concept wasn't really working for them. And it states in the article, 2 years into development, the team realized that the design wasn't working. The scope was just way too big. Originally, the project had been designed as a survival style game with a high degree of player freedom in it, but that level of freedom conflicted with the team's goal of creating a highly competitive experience. And as a result, the project underwent a major pivot. And back in January of 2024, the team shifted toward what we would eventually come to know as HydroxyZ, a raid shooter that streamlined many of the survival mechanics into a faster and more competitive structure. And in other words, HydroxyZ was not the studio's original concept. It was the result of a significant redesign relatively late in the development. So similar to what I mentioned in my video on Anthem and its recent closure back in January, an unclear vision for a product and a game in this case can hurt future development quite severely, and definitely comes down to defining the scope and focusing on what's necessary for the game to truly flourish. And that is very critical for the process to succeed in a way that would streamline the development and ease potential setbacks that you would have in the development phases. And so Wildlight planned to release HydroxyZ in 2026, and as they did, and over time build upon it in a live service title manner that we are used to seeing with these titles. They were planning on improving it and gradually add new things and add to the experience through updates and the player feedback that they would be getting. But this approach is very common in modern multiplayer games, but it also carries a lot of risk with it. And launching a live service game with the expectation that core systems will be tuned after release can be dangerous, to say the least. Players rarely wait around for a game to eventually become good, or potentially. First impressions often determine whether a multiplayer game gains enough momentum or if it in fact just disappears. Now, a recent title was Suicide Squad Killer Justice League, and the very first impression of that game were quite negative actually, and sentiment around the game was that people weren't that interested in what was shown in the various clips that they released as marketing. And that game struggled heavily after its launch, and it struggled to find its footing really and foster a community of people who weren't interested in the game originally, and they really struggled to make these people want to jump in and try it. Now, another issue highlighted by Jason Schreier was the studio's reluctance to expose the game to a wider audience before launch, and a particular quote reads, "One solution may have been to open the game to the outside world to start building a community and garner feedback from a wider audience." But according to former employees, leadership rejected that idea altogether. They wanted to create a strategy used for Apex Legends, which famously launched without prior public testing and immediately gained massive attention. However, replicating that strategy in a very different environment carries a lot of risk with it, and early community feedback can be one of the most valuable tools in multiplayer development. So wider testing can reveal usability problems, gameplay frustrations, and systemic design flaws long before a game really reaches its potential and its release date. And so without that feedback loop, studios often discover critical issues after launch when it may already be too late. And so when HydroxyZ finally launched, the critics quickly pointed out several issues that it had. Reviewers were criticizing the large map sizes, the tedious mechanics such as the mining, and an overall complexity of the game, and many of which were remnants of earlier versions of the game. Another major problem was that the game became significantly less enjoyable when playing with strangers without voice chat or proximity chat. This was the kind of issue that broader pre-release testing might have identified earlier, but I mean, it's hard to say really, but it definitely should have been on their minds that when you want to create a live service game that is focused around these similar mechanics that we see in Overwatch or Marvel Rivals, it is fairly certain that you might need some kind of proximity chat to at least talk with your teammates. And the player numbers reflected these problems, peaking at just shy of 100,000 concurrent players on the release day. And And according to Jason Schreier, a week after launch, the game had lost 90% of its players, and you can see that in the Steam charts as well. So it is backed up what he's saying, of course. The studio reacted quickly, and they did release a 5v5 mode that many players actually seemed to enjoy. However, by that point, the damage had already been done. The new mode was praised, but it wasn't enough to bring people back. The game had been branded as uninteresting already, so people looked elsewhere for entertainment. Now, I'm not saying that introducing a 5v5 would have saved the game. Far from it, but it certainly was a step in the right direction, and it showed that they actually cared and listened to the feedback from the players. I've had my own issues with the game, with uninteresting gameplay loop, and the raid mechanic for me just didn't really hit. The traversal of the map felt boring. The mounts certainly helped a bit, but it needed more than that, in my opinion. Now, despite the declining player numbers, many employees reportedly believed that the studio had enough financial funding to continue to improve the game. But at a meeting back in February, just 2 weeks after the launch, on the 11th, employees were told that the studio had run out of money. And so what was publicly released in a statement was that around 100 people were being laid off. And during the meeting, management explained that Tencent had pulled their funding, which clearly marked an end for the studio at that point. And so when I asked what really went wrong, several former developers described the problem with a single word, and that was hubris. They believed that the studio's leadership assumed they could replicate the success behind Apex Legends, regardless of how much the gaming landscape had changed since then. From a strategic point of view, this resembles what management literature describes as a competency trap. And so when decision makers rely heavily on past successes when approaching new products, they often become unable to view this new product in another way of how past experiences and products had been developed. And in this case, the dynamic way of may have been reinforced by the fact that many of the developers previously worked on Apex Legends at Respawn before coming to Wildlight Entertainment. The design logic behind one of the decade's biggest multiplayer successes was effectively carried into the new studio. However, the broader gaming market had evolved significantly since then. Player expectations had shifted, the multiplayer ecosystem had become far more crowded, and many players were increasingly showing signs of live service fatigue. Now, the situation can also be interpreted through the lens of what is known as dynamic capabilities, which emphasizes a firm's ability to sense, seize, and transform in response to environmental change in the industry, or however the company views the gaming market as a whole. And so organizations must first sense these shifts in the market, then they're gonna have to seize the opportunity in a theoretical way, really. They're gonna have to seize these emerging opportunities through appropriate strategic decisions, and finally they're gonna transform and reorganize their capabilities to better align with these kinds of changes. Either the leadership underestimated how much the player expectation and competitive dynamics had evolved since the release of Apex Legends back in 2019, or the studio fully dismissed the shift in the industry altogether. Now, the timing also played a role in this, and Apex Legends entered the Battle Royale market during a period of rapid expansion and a relatively open competitive space. But Highguard, by contrast, entered a far more mature ecosystem in which dominant titles were already established and player attention had become significantly harder to capture. So taken together, the challenges may not simply have been design execution. It may have been a matter of strategic framing, an assumption that a formula which worked in one market cycle could be successfully replicated in a very different one. And entering an industry heavily saturated by big games requires new entrants to distinguish themselves very clearly, because otherwise, why would gamers switch games when they don't even know what they're jumping into? The switching costs plays a factor in this, and You gotta make something that players are willing to switch from, even though they might have already spent money on the game that they're leaving behind. And that is very important lesson to take with you. You can't expect players to just jump ship whenever something new might release. You gotta make it worthwhile for them to jump in and try. You gotta make a product that is finished enough for players to truly experience the vision that you might have had for the game. You can't just release a half-baked game like we saw with Anthem. There was a lot of shortcomings that it had, and ultimately, as was revealed by Mark Dara at the time, who led the project, there were a lot of problems with Anthem during its development, and there were unclear visions that weren't fully visualized in the product, and the things that did end up coming to the game were not good enough. And we saw that with Highguard, they had a lot of different things going on, and none of them really worked together in a cohesive manner. Far from it, really. And so, in the end, it's difficult to say what the future might hold for Wildlight Entertainment. And with Tencent pulling their funding from the studio's financial situation is very uncertain. Without significant backing, the most immediate speculation is that the studio may eventually close altogether if it cannot secure any new funding. Another possibility is restructuring. The studio could scale down significantly, as they have already done and might continue to do so, to try and keep a small core team to attempt to develop some new projects. But in some cases, studios recover from failed launch titles such as this by just using a reduced team to rebuild and to try again. However, the path comes with challenges. Wildlight is now closely associated with the failure of Highguard, and reputational baggage like that can make it quite difficult to attract new players and investors or new talent for future projects. So one solution might be that we see a rebranding of the studio and effectively renaming the studio and starting fresh under a new identity. While that wouldn't necessarily erase the past entirely, it could help distance a future project from the studio's first and very public setback. For now, though, the next chapter for Wildlight remains uncertain. With that being said, thank you all for watching. I know this news isn't exactly breaking, but then again, I wanted to offer my own thoughts on this topic. So anyway, take care, everyone.